The night the house finally exhaled the letters, I heard my name written by a hand I thought the earth had already eaten, and I knew, as surely as I know the creak of the fifth stair, that my marriage had been built on a theft of the heart. You must understand where I am as I tell you this, where I have always been really. In this old English house, my dear, the rain has a way of composing itself on the windows in long trembling lines that look like a child's music. The corridor smells of beeswax and secrets. The hearth is sulking with a small steady flame. I still keep the heavy velvet curtains tied back with fraying cord. I still polish the brass bell pulls. No one tugs anymore. When the wind shifts, the house remembers to breathe. The walls draw in, the floorboards sigh out, and the roses on the wallpaper open like little damp mouths. I found the first letter crouched like a wounded bird beneath the loose board by the bed, where I once taught a man to love me. The board had never lifted for me before. That night, after years of walking around the emptiness, I felt it give. I eased my fingers beneath, and something brushed back. Paper, soft as a cheek. I pulled out an envelope, the color of old cream with my name. On it, my name in a careful, boyish hand I had not seen since the summer my heart was 19. Ruth, Elias. I sat very still, the way you sit when a doctor is about to tell you your body is a ship, sailing away without you. I mouthed his name like a prayer, like a sin. Elias Finch, with his father's patched coat and a pocket full of poems. Elias who tasted of wild apples and grit. Elias whom I was told to forget, and so I did what good girls do and married a better man. Or so I thought. I slit the letter with my thumbnail. The paper broke with the sigh of something held too long. My dear Ruth, it began, and the voice rose up from the page like breath against my ear. I read by the lamplight, the rain tapping at the window panes, as if the night itself wished to peep in. He wrote of work at the docks that bled him. He wrote of a room that stank of coal and loneliness. He wrote of a poem he had promised to write, for me, shaped like a hand, so that when I placed my palm upon it, I might feel him. He wrote of the way my laugh got lodged in his throat for hours after he left me at the gate. He wrote that he had received none of my letters, none, and had begun to be afraid that someone had decided for us. But he had never decided to stop loving me. The date was 2 months after the day I said yes to Thomas. The wind pushed harder against the window, and somewhere a door I hadn't opened in years rattled. It was the sort of sound that once sent my feet flying with a candle in hand, hot like a bird. Now I knew better. Houses get old and they ache too. Still, I put a hand to my throat to steady it. Some girls are trained to be quiet. I was trained to be brave. It is a trick of the blood. My wedding ring. Do you want me to describe it? Thin gold, flawed where it had been resized. A man's hands will tell you everything you need to know about him. Thomas Avery's hands were clever, quiet, expensive hands. With nails he took a knife to. Every night, as if he were scraping off the day, he'd come into my father's shop the winter before the thaw, looking for a clock with a pendulum he could see through. A skeleton clock, he said, so that the mechanism would never be hidden, so that the heart of things might always be visible. He looked like trust, dressed as a gentleman. I said yes to him because the world had taught me that Elias was a story with a poor ending, and Thomas was the roof I could stand under without getting wet. He bought me a pearl comb. He brought me to this house and said, "We'll fill it with joy, Ruth. We'll make it say your name." We did fill it with rugs and giggles from children I mothered without ever managing to carry one, with the honeyed smell of marmalade and the vinegar quarrels of marriage, with songs I hummed when I believed in my own softness and the practiced silences of a wife who wanted to keep the peace. He taught me this house had a history worth respect. Hidden priests under the stairs. A bell in the library that once summoned staff instead of ghosts. Deeds older than anyone alive to hold them. He kissed me in the corridor where the light is always blue. He fed the fire as if it were a pet we kept. But he did not love the truth, the way he said. How long did he keep the letters? If my heart were a ledger, if I could show you every mark, you might see how he revised my life with a steady, careful hand, crossing out what frightened him and illuminating what made him shine. Thomas never raised his voice to me. He never struck me. He simply surrounded my choices with such a wealth of his kindness that I grew poor in my own. I stood, letter in hand, and the house did a thing I had seen it do once before, on a day that changed the map of my faith. It breathed in such a way that a draft lifted the curtain in front of the long mirror and showed me, quite precisely, that I was not alone in the room. I turned quickly, foolishly, and there I was, old and small and soft. No ghost beyond my own. The letter trembled. I could have put it back. Some women can live untouched by the water that passes over them. But I was never taught how to refuse. A river. I slid my fingers back under the board and pulled. 27 letters. 27. Tied with a plaited red thread of the sort we used in the nursery, to mark which blanket belonged to which little body when the evacuees shared beds, when the war emptied the cities and poured their children into the countryside like spilled buttons. I held those letters as if they could bruise. My dear, before I continue, if this story has touched your heart even a little, do subscribe and stay with me through the end. I have so much to tell you. And you, tell me, have you ever forgiven someone who broke your heart? I'd love to hear your story too. I carried the letters to the bed, my knees suddenly older than my face, and I sat, and the house sat with me. The rain had settled into the sort of steady rhythm that could hypnotize an honest man. The lamp, gowned in a yellow shade, pooled its light in a soft circle. I opened the next, and felt time undo itself. He had looked for me at the bakery and found only the red-cheeked girl with flour in her hair. He had gone to the church and asked the vicar to call on my father, and the vicar had pursed his mouth and said that Mr. Avery had made a suitable offer, and that sometimes life moved us to places we didn't expect. He had stood at the gate of this very house, he wrote, staring up at the windows, feeling like a word that no one wanted to say. Do you see it? The shape of the theft? He had written and written, and every word had been intercepted by a gentleman whose hand scraped himself clean every night. There is a place in the long gallery where the wainscoting peels back if you put your thumb just so. A priest hole, Thomas told me, built in the time when men hid their faith in cavities of wood and luck. There are other holes here too. A house is a nest of lungs, rooms inhaling and exhaling quietly, wanting to be filled. A careful man can tuck anything into the pauses of a house. Letters, ledgers, women. I should tell you about my forgiveness, but that came later. At first, it was only a harvest of nouns. Anger, grief, foolishness, pity, rage that made the lampshade tremble with my breath. The house, sweet thing, seemed to lean toward me as if it could offer a shoulder. It kept me from falling off the bed. There was a moment, I am not proud, when I pressed the letters to my mouth and breathed him in, the dust and ink, as if I could resuscitate 5 decades and make them stand, blinking in the doorway, and I would be 19 again. Pearled comb, discarded on a bureau I never wanted. When I married Thomas, I thought I was sewing a seam that would never come undone. The day I walked into this house as a bride, the portrait of the woman who had run it before me hung crooked. Her eyes seemed to follow you. She has the persistent look of someone who has buried many things and knows where every bloom will be. I laughed at my nerves, and Thomas took my waist, and we danced without music in the long hall, and he promised this house would be bookended by our laughs. I did not know then that it had been his fingers, and not time, which had turned the portrait gently askew, so that he could look back at a wife who was dead, and convince himself he was not the kind of man who forgot. He was very good at forgetting what was inconvenient. I did not mean to be unkind to him. I loved a version of him so completely. I did not notice the seams, how they frayed into little truthful threads. He would stand in the doorway of the nursery and watch the evacuee children sleep, and his face would go so soft you could almost press your thumb into it and leave a mark. He said it moved him to care. He said it made him want to do right. He built a new cupboard in the pantry. He oversaw the retiling of the scullery. He funded the village library, and his name was carved into the stone outside. Thomas Avery, a man of means and mercy. He wore a poppy every November and sometimes forgot to take it off, and he kept my letters from me. I know, my dear, I can hear you thinking, did he love me at all? He loved me with the sort of love that is careful to count itself twice, to be sure it isn't giving more than it expects to receive. He loved the way I looked sitting in his house. He loved the way my quiet sounded in rooms where he had been alone too long. He loved that my presence told the world a story that made him even more golden at the edges. He loved what I made of him. But the truth, that raw country, you cannot fence it out with manners. The last letter I opened that night was dated the week before my wedding. He begged to meet him by the river. He wrote that he had something for me, something that would make sense of everything. A coin, perhaps, or a line from a poem I had not known was mine. He had waited under the willow until dusk made black promises to the water, and I had not come. I had not come because a man who told the truth when it declared him full and edited it when it declared him empty had called at noon with roses and champagne and a suggestion for a honeymoon. I pressed my knuckles into my breastbone as if I could knock. I have always believed that men like Thomas do not begin as villains. They become what they practice. He wanted me so badly he cleaned the world of any who had first claim. He put a quiet itch under the board, tied with a red thread, and left me to scratch at it when no one else was listening. Ruth, my name then, from a place that did not exist unless you had cheated your way into it. The voice was not live. It was a memory. The way a house can replay a sound if it has loved it enough. For years I had thought the house said my name with his voice. That night I heard Elias say it again, as if he had only stepped into the next room to touch the banister and promised to sand it smooth in the morning. I stood. The long mirror showed me a woman I recognized, but had not met. That is what betrayal does. It gives you a stranger's mother, a stranger's wife, a stranger's widow. It handed me back parts of myself I had taught myself to starve. I folded the letters and slid them into the pocket of my cardigan. My bad habit, pockets. And I went to the corridor. The moon had hauled itself out from behind the rain and was making a brave attempt at visiting. The floorboards kept their counsel. In the long gallery, a moth traced the lampshade like a pilgrim around a saint. On the fourth panel of the wainscoting, I placed my thumb. You might not have believed it, but I knew how to do this. Thomas had shown me once, laughing, a demonstration only. For fun, he said, and pressed a little, and a door sneezed itself open, and I laughed and pretended to be scared. And later in bed, I let his hands, those elegant editorial hands, teach me to think that nothing was missing. The panel released. With a sigh, the house letting out a secret, as if it were tired of holding it. The cavity beyond smelled of wood and old shame. I felt along the shelf and found, before my fingers found the ledger, a small parcel wrapped in brown. It was the size of a ring box. My hand trembled, and I nearly put it back. I wish I could tell you I am better than curiosity. I slid off the twine and peeled away the paper and found, nestled in tissue that had once been white, a ring. Gold. Thin, flawed where it had been resized. The inside engraved. Ruth, forgive me. It was not my ring. My ring's inscription read, T to R, in our day, forever. This one, the wood dust white in the groove of the letters, said E to R. If only they had let me. I think I might have sat down on the floor at this point, the old arthritis finding me as faithfully as any lover. The house listened. Houses are good at this. Witness and concealment. I slid the ring onto my finger beside the other, and they kissed like old friends who had once been told to sit at different tables. Forgive me, he had meant to ask with this. The words carved by a man whose hands made splinters and songs. But the man I married had taken both our voices and hid them where only the wood could hear. I knew then what pain does if you give it enough clocks to sit beside. It becomes a historian. It sets things in order. The house liked this, I think. It likes when the objects remember their purpose. Plates near a table. Bell pulls near a hand. Rings near the heart. It creaked with what I swear was relief. Thomas, I said out loud. And the way the name moved through the corridor, making the moth hesitate, told me that saying his name in this place had never belonged to me alone. I held the ledger and the little parcel and my letters, the way a mother holds too many parcels the day before Christmas, and I walked the long corridor to the library. The library is a man's room, and yet I made it mine by moving a single chair. I turned it so that I could see the door and the fire at once. Women learn how to make rooms safe with the smallest rearrangements, chairs, locks, the directions of our own eyes. I placed the ledger on my lap and opened it. Names, dates, amounts, the careful, quiet handwriting of a person who believes that tidy wreckage is not wreckage at all. The ledger did not tell me what it was counting at first. Only the initials and the notes in the margin, comfort, adoption, transfer, words that could mean charity or theft, depending upon the angle of light. I traced the columns as if the day could be changed by the warmth of my finger. I will not lie to you. My breath made the flame shake. There are pieces of my story that cannot be told without both love and rage wearing the same coat. The evacuees we housed here, little sugar-crumbed mouths, knees like apples, hair smelling of smoke and city rain, were counted too, in ways that made me quiet in my bones, not only by the government's tidy boxes, but by men who thought paper could make a mother eternal in the right column, and a child saleable in the next. Thomas had a line for everything. He had lines for our joy, and for our tragedy, and for our alibis. He lived by their weight. When you asked him, he would tell you he had given the house purpose. Charity, art, restoration. He would tell you that any money that moved was merely the oil that kept the good machine running. Ing, who kept the laundry ledger, who balanced our carrots and our coal, who knew the exact moment the kettle would sing and the window would fog, sat with the big ledger and realized my kitchen arithmetic had been the most honest moral math in this house. I closed the book and placed both rings on the table and did not cry. Sorrow has a timetable. It arrives, leaves, returns, brings a cousin. I learned early that if you let it build its camp too close to the fireplace, it will burn your bread and tell you that you asked it to. I will tell you what I did instead. I went softly to the nursery. I pulled back the green blanket on the small bed by the radiator where little Billy once slept, who came in smelling of London and thunder, who learned to say his L's as though the letter were always laughing, who left with a couple whose coat buttons shone like coins, and who sent us a postcard shaped like a horse from Blackpool. I laid the letters there, and the ring, and the ledger, and the truth of 3 decades, which was a heavy object, heavier than any table, and I let them rest in that place, meant for sleeping. The window moved with the breath of the wind. The curtains whispered to one another. Behind me, the door gave one small tick, the sound of the latch settling into what it knows. Tell me, my dear, have you ever held proof in your hands that the life you were given was a story someone else wrote over? Yours. It is a kind of drowning in a house with no water. And yet, look at me. I am old, and I am dry, and I have lived, and the world now praises my name. You smile a little at that, perhaps. A grandmother making a proclamation. I don't make it lightly. There is a museum downstairs now, small and tidy, with my name on, a brass plaque that the school children run their fingers over, as if it might grant them something. They call me a guardian, a whistleblower, a friend of the lost. Journalists came, years ago, when my hands were steadier than my voice, and they asked me how I could forgive a man who stacked paper where love should have been and called it virtue. I told them, forgiveness is not a broom. You cannot sweep with it and expect the floor to shine. Forgiveness is a window. You open it, and you must allow whatever the day is to enter. Sometimes it is cold. Sometimes it is a bird. I did not tell them that I found the courage to open that window because a dead man's letters called my name, the way only the truth can. Before I turn this page for you, come closer. My voice has to stretch now, across rooms and oceans. If you've stayed with me so far, sit a little nearer, my dear, before I continue. If this story has touched your heart, do subscribe and stay with me through the end. It is a long corridor we must walk together, but I promise you, I know where the light switches are, and I won't leave you in the dark. And tell me, have you ever chosen the good, only to learn later it was the wrong good? I will listen. There is more to tell of Elias and of Thomas, of the way one man held my letters like oxygen and the other starved me of them, of the afternoon when a policeman with Elias's eyes stood in my library and asked whether my husband kept accounts, of the day the house itself saved a child by refusing to let a door close. There is the fire. There is a name I wrote on the wall in pencil that no one has noticed yet. There is the open window. But for now, hear the slow, faithful tick of the hallway clock, the one Thomas chose because it had nothing between you and the gears. It has always told the truth, even when we haven't. It says it is time for me to set down this ledger and pick up the next part of this night. The morning after the house gave me the letters, someone knocked at the door with the slow, certain insistence of a person who believes his purpose will outlast the weather. The rain had not finished speaking to the roof. The gutters were busy and pleased. I stood very still in the hall and listened. A woman who has lived long enough learns to tell a story by the sound of a knock. This was not a neighbour's politeness or a salesman's hope. It was Judy, wearing a dark coat. I opened the door and there he was, a man whose eyes had a familiar grief to them, as if they'd stood in the same wind I had at some point and learned to squint the same way. He held his hat in both hands, the brim wet. There was mud on the stitches of his shoes, honest mud, the sort that suggests a person has walked a little too far. Mrs. Avery, he asked. Yes, I said. And the house did that small thing it does when it wishes to be seen behaving well. It straightened its shoulders, if a house can have shoulders. Do come in. He stepped over the threshold with the care of a man entering a church to find out whether he believes. He was not handsome. Not the way Thomas had been handsome in a newspaper way. He had a kind of weary intelligence that made you want to offer him a chair and a story. A policeman's face. When he set his hat on the hall table, he looked at the skeleton clock and smiled. Something private and soft. Then he held out a card. Detective Constable Elias Finch. If the house had a throat, it cleared it then. I felt the old air stand up inside me. I'm afraid the name has a history here, I said, taking the card and sliding it between my fingers as if it were a thin blade. What can I do for you, detective? I'm here regarding Mr. Thomas Avery, he said, and the careful, official voice rested lightly on the veneer of my life. We're reviewing several wartime trusts and adoption records. There are discrepancies, names without signatures, payments without recipients. We've reason to believe relevant documents may be here. He paused. And if I may be frank, I'm here about a different matter as well. It may be personal. You'd better come into the library, I said. It holds its tongue better than the hall. I led him down the corridor that keeps its light blue all year. He glanced at the paintings, the way a man glances at photographs, on a stranger's mantle, respectful, curious, aware that he's looking at a story he is not in. I put him in my chair, the one that lets you see the fire and the door both, and I took the one that keeps your back to the window, because it's only polite to give a guest the comfortable sightlines. The kettle in the kitchen had a memory of boiling at this hour. I heard it hum to itself and decided to let it work it out on its own. Mrs. Avery, he said, as the fire performed the small ceremony of being watched, did you know my father? I could not help it. I touched my ring, both rings, and the metal remembered the night before. Say his name, I said softly, because I wanted to hear how the syllables wore his mouth. Elias Finch, he said, and my name in his pocket twitched like a bird waking up. I knew him, I answered, when I was a girl. He put a hand inside his coat and drew out a photograph that had survived a flood or a fire. Edges flayed, corner missing. It was a photograph of a piece of paper. On the paper, a poem shaped like a hand. He held it at the tip of his fingers, as if it might be shy, and the right gentleness would coax it into being braver. He wrote this for a girl named Ruth, he said. My aunt kept it. She said he carried the original until the week he died, and that he sent this photograph to her because he wanted someone to know he had once promised something, and it had not been kept. She thought perhaps you would have liked to see it. The room made itself smaller, so that the silence could sit closer to us. I reached out, slow as a tide, and touched the edge. The lines were his. The curve of the letters made an old part of me feel suddenly young and foolish and selfish. The way youth allows itself to be, when it is very certain the story will make it to the end. The poem's palm was full of words about holding, and the fingers were a litany of ordinary things I'd loved, as if they were holy: soap bubbles, blackberries, the thin slap of a wave against a rowing boat, the click a jar makes when you seal it and know it will keep. I've been looking for you, Mrs. Avery, DC Finch said quietly. Not because of my father. I had given up finding anything worth having there. Apart from this, he tapped the photograph. No, I came because your husband's name is everywhere in the files we're reopening, in the margins, in the columns. He was praised for his charity. He has plaques and benches, and the pew you stand behind every Remembrance Sunday. But there are children who were moved like coins, and there is money that does not like the light. I thought, if anyone could help me, it would be the woman who knew him that closely. Guilt is a quick bird. It darts and hides before you can put a name to it. I felt it then, bright and nervous. I had been at those meetings, pouring tea, knitting a row, humming, keeping the minutes of things I did not understand. I had smiled at the couples with the coin-bright buttons and signed thank you notes without asking the questions that would have made me a different person. I had known the smell of a child's neck and thought the world was gentle because I could be Mr. Num. Avery has been dead 12 years, I said. I cannot offer him up to your questions the way you might like, but I can tell you what the house has told me. And what is that? He asked. That it had more secrets than we knew, I said, and the words were honest enough to make the air a little easier. I found something last night, perhaps 2 somethings, perhaps 10. I have not yet learned how to count them. Comfort yourself with tea while I decide whether my courage stretches to what you're asking. My dear, I say to you now, in the soft space between his breath and mine, before I tell you what I brought him, if this story has touched your heart even a little, do subscribe and stay with me through the end. A house is a long tale, and so is a life. I'll walk with you through both. And tell me, have you ever had a name knock on your door that you thought you'd buried? I wonder what you did. I went to the kitchen with the soft impatience of a woman about to do something she cannot turn back from. The kettle had decided to boil after all. I took down the blue cups, the ones with the uneven glaze that make tea taste honest, and the tin of digestives that last forever because I no longer have the appetite for sugar. I used to. The door to the long gallery watched me as I passed. It is a funny thing, the way a hallway can listen. At the panel, my thumb found the old carpentry's shy spot. The wood came away, shyly as before, and I slid my hand into the cavity and retrieved the ledger, the ring, the bundle of letters. For a moment, I held them against my chest, the way you hold a child you're about to send away. Then I brought them to the library and put them on the low table between us, with the ceremony of a person returning stolen goods to their owner, DC. Finch did not reach for anything. He looked at me first, weighing whether this was a test or a gift. When I nodded, he picked up the bundle of letters with both hands, like bread he didn't yet have the right to slice. He read the first address, the date, the name. He took a breath so small I might have missed it if I were not herself, a woman of small breaths. My father, he said. Your father, I confirmed. And this, he gestured toward the ledger. My husband's heart, I said, because if I had told him it was a list of figures and names and words in tidy columns, he would have missed the violence in it. He opened it, turned a page, read the headers. His posture changed, the way a man's back rearranges itself when he's about to discover the thing he's been hunting in the wrong weather. He traced lines with his finger. He stopped at a column. That read transfer. He read aloud to practice belief. Comfort. Transfer. Fee waived. Fee adjusted. He looked up. Did he call it that? Comfort. Thomas called pain what made him look generous, I said. He called profit what he could explain. I watched his eyes find a set of initials. EF, there, he said. Look, EF Adoption Council, £50. Notation, declined. Contact made. What is contact made? He asked, voice suddenly too calm. It is a phrase a man writes when he has removed himself from the story, I said. My throat felt as dry as flour. My husband liked to think that if he wrote something cleanly enough, it would wash itself. I think, DC Finch said slowly, testing each word to see if it held, that your husband paid my father to go away, or paid someone else to make sure he went, I said, meeting his eyes, not flinching from the resemblance that lived there. There is a ring as well. I slid it toward him, the thin band with the confession on the inside. He picked it up, as if it might break of its own heartbreak. E to R, he read. If only they had let me. He closed his eyes, the way men do, who have been taught not to cry in front of women. and in that brief darkness, I saw the boy he had been, and the man he had made his bones into, to carry the weight of that boy. My mother told me he had loved a girl who could not come to the willow, because the world said he did not deserve to speak her name inside any good room. She said he held on to a ring he could not give, and that it made him thin with the hunger of it. I did not marry him, I said. The simplicity of it could almost have made me laugh, if I were not so entirely through with laughter of that sort. I married Thomas, and Thomas moved the furniture of my life so cleverly that by the time I realized the room I was sitting in did not belong to me, the inside of my hands had learned the shape of its chair. D.C. Finch opened his eyes. "Mrs. Avery," he said, and his voice had crossed from official to human. "Will you make a statement? Will you give these documents to the investigation? We can apply for an order, but I would rather you put them into the light because you wish to. When you love a house, you become its keeper, whether or not the deed is written in your name," I said. "I am its keeper, and I was his wife, whether or not I love him as a widow ought to. I will give you what belongs to the truth." He nodded once, as if we had done the sort of business that makes a person more, rather than less. He turned a few more pages, stopped, frowned. E. Finch, Employment Assistance. Revoked pending review. Donation to Doc Relief, silent. The entry had a little cross next to it, the kind of mark Thomas made when he wanted to remember a lie. My father died in a warehouse fire. D.C. Finch said, staring at that cross as if it were a door he was considering opening without a key. He had gone back in for a ledger. That's what the foreman told us. He had a habit of keeping other men's records in his coat. He gave a humorless smile. Seems he died of the thing he loved most. The world will always find a way to burn what is dangerous to it, I said. Sometimes it is a warehouse. Sometimes it is a woman's letterbox. He looked up at me then, with Elias's eyes, and I had to sit very still so that I did not leave my body. "Will you tell me about him?" he asked quietly. The way he laughed, the way he said please, what he would have looked like by a fire if the fire was kind, and so I did, for an hour that stretched and curled like smoke. I told him about the way Elias's palms held calluses, as if they were medals. I told him the way he would stop, mid-walk when he saw something he liked, a dog's ear, a line of laundry, a girl's face, and the way in stopping, he taught me that there is no such thing as not enough time if your heart knows what it's looking at. I told him about the willow, and the poem, and the ring he could not give, and how I had been given a different ring, by a different man, and thought it was the correct answer to a question I had not properly heard. He listened like someone being given a drink of water after going too long without admitting thirst. When we ran out of the shape of that hour, I told him about the children. I told him about Billy's L's, and the green blanket, and the little girl who hid bread crusts in her sleeves as if famine were a person who might come knocking. I told him about the night the house refused a door. We had 12 evacuees then, and 3 housemaids who were too young to remember what silence felt like. The winter cough had moved through us, all like a tide. I had put the kettle on in the night for the 5th time and was walking past the cellar door when I heard something that was not the kettle and not the cough and not the wind. It was the sound a latch makes when it tries to be a lock and fails. I pushed at the cellar door and it stuck, and then yielded, grudgingly, like a man who has made up his mind to be reasonable after all. The smell of coal was a living thing at the bottom of the stairs. I saw a spill of light that should not have been there. The boiler door was half open, and the boy who'd insisted he was too brave to be frightened of the cellar, Billy, of course it was Billy, was curled beside it, cheeks bright with fever, eyes wide as the moon, frozen in the way a child gets. when it discovers one more thing the world can do to it. He had come down to be brave, and the older boy who dared him had fled when the door jammed, because he had not learned yet that there are doors you must stay to fight. I ran, old breath and young legs, and when I tried to pull the boiler, door closed, the hinge caught, as if it had learned the shape of what could have been, and decided against it. The house refused to let the metal shut. It is a strange thing to be grateful to a hinge. I scooped Billy up. He was light, the way London children were then, all eyes and knees, and carried him upstairs, while the house held the door ajar for us, so that the bad air had a place to go that was not into the small, bold lungs of a boy who still laughed his L's. Afterwards, in the morning, Thomas said he had meant to oil that hinge, and thanked me for my quick thinking, and the child moved through the day a little like a ghost, which is what happens to us when we visit the edge of something and are sent back with our hair still smelling like the place we almost did not leave. DC, Finch smiled, an intact thing, for the first time. He became a policeman too, he said. A ridiculous sentence, and yet it felt like something the world might just allow. So many of us did. He paused and then added softly, as if offering me a confession to set beside my own. When I came up the path just now, I felt I had done this walk before. This house has that about it, doesn't it? It remembers you. It does, I said. And if it decides you are worthy, it refuses to let you destroy yourself in its dark. He closed the ledger. Mrs. Avery, he said, back to the tone. That lets a person know there will be paperwork. I will have to take these. We'll receipt them. We'll keep them safe. I'll come back with statements for you to sign, and you will have to endure the kind of questions that make a person tired in new places. Are you prepared? I could have said no. There are women my age who have folded themselves into houses, like letters never posted. I have loved them too. But I had heard my name last night, written by a hand. I thought the earth had eaten, and once a name has been returned to you, your mouth isn't yours until you use it. I said. There is a thing I would like to do first. And what is that? To go to the willow, I said. I owe someone a goodbye that feels like a hello. He nodded, and the way he did it told me he had stood by more than one tree and made more than one vow to the air. He rose, gathering the ledger, the letters, the ring, the photograph of a poem shaped like a hand. At the door, he hesitated. May I ask something foolish, he said. By all means, I replied. Fools have always been my favorite prophets. What would you have done if he had come back? He asked. Your husband. What would you have said to Thomas if you had found these while he still had the habit of setting his watch by the skeleton clock and removing his boots on the third stair so as not to wake you? I looked at the fire and saw my younger face. In it, in the place where the flames make women look like they might still be made out of expectations and soap. I would have asked him to sit with me in the long gallery where the light is blue. I said. I would have put the letters in his lap, the way he put the world in mine, and asked him to read my name where it belonged. And then I would have asked him to tell me the story he had written about himself, twice. Once the way he told it to everyone else, and then the way the house heard it. And what then? Then, I said. I would have forgiven him for not being brave enough to trust me with what frightened him, and I would have refused to forgive the part of him that chose to steal not only from me, but from children and men and old women who have the same timetable as kettles when it comes to boiling. Forgiveness is not the same thing as forgetting. I would have asked him to choose between the house and the ledger. And when he chose the ledger, because men like him do until they don't, I would have told him the house had chosen me. He looked at me with something that might have been respect, or might have been the realization that he had just watched a woman pick up a sword she had been storing behind her good linen for years. "Thank you," he said, "for the ledger, for the letters, for what you didn't decide to keep." He left, and the house let the door settle behind him with the dignified hush of a stage curtain. I stood in the hall and listened to his footsteps on the gravel, and it was a peculiar thing, but the clock in the hall, that honest spine thing, ticked like applause. "My dear, before I open the nursery window and let the willow in, tell me, if you had been me, would you have waited 50 years to open a floorboard? What would you have done with the ledger when a man with your first love's eyes asked for it? If this story has found the part of you that keeps your oldest promise, do stay. Subscribe if you wish. It keeps me company to imagine you sitting with me while the house explains itself. I took my coat. I pinned my scarf the way my mother taught me, 2 inches below the collarbone, so that it catches and keeps. I slipped both rings back onto my finger and felt them settle like birds returning to a wire. After a truck has passed, the garden was a damp argument between rain and earth. The willow stood by the river, like a woman who has learned to touch her own hair when she is thinking. The water had that slow brown patience the river wears when it is listening to a story it already knows the ending to. Under the willow, the ground remembers. It dips a little where the feet have gone. It softens where men have stood in their own weather and made their mouths into doors. I put my hand on the trunk and felt the thin vibrations of what lives and what passes for living, and it occurred to me that everything that grows up also has a sound that is very close to weeping and very close to singing, and people mix them up and call it one thing or the other depending on what the day has made of them. "Elias," I said, aloud, because there are names that deserve the air. "I am so late." A small noise came from the path. Shoes on wet stone. I did not turn. The shape of the world around me changed the way it does when another body has entered your circle, and your body knows before your eyes do. The willow shifted, and a leaf, last year's, fell at my feet with the sort of drama only something very small can manage without being ridiculous. "It seems I am late too," DC Finch said from behind me, and I smiled because there are men with manners and men with good timing, and it is a rare thing to find both. We stood a small while as if we were waiting for a third thing to join us, something you cannot put your hand on without making it run. Birds scolded us for standing still with empty hands. The river made the sound of a skirt being lifted just enough to keep it from the wet. I spoke to a man who remembers the fire, DC Finch said finally. He was a boy then, a runner at the docks. He said a gentleman turned up after the smoke and asked questions in a way that made everyone's mouths tired. He said the gentleman had a ring on his finger and kept removing it to polish it while he talked. He said the gentleman put an envelope in the foreman's breast pocket and said he was sorry for their loss and that he would make sure the papers wrote about the bravery of the men who went back in. He said the gentleman's name was Avery. There! Willow scratched the sky in a way that could have been grief or could have been the ordinary business of trees. He always did pay for the part of the story he liked, I said. I hope he paid well. I hope he bought those men's wives a kitchen full of jars with tight lids and slippers for the winter. I hope he bought their children enough milk to make their bones forget something. DC Finch took the ring out of his pocket and set it in my palm. For you, he said, for your willow, for your story. We'll need the ledger, but a ring is a kind of promise, and I think it belongs to the person who can keep it without lying to it. I closed my hand and felt the ridiculous miracle of metal and inscription and the way a lowercase letter can take your breath away 50 years late. Then I opened my hand again. No, I said, I will not wear a ring that was never mine to keep, but we will bury it here, and the tree will learn the shape of it. And when the roots tell the trunk stories, They will tell it that a man loved a woman, and the world was very busy, and did not think to stop them. He dug with his penknife, ridiculous as that sounds, and I placed the ring in the small wound, like a stitch. We stood when we were finished, and did not say amen, because sometimes the quiet is amen enough. On the way back to the house, we passed the stone where children used to jump to test whether they were brave enough for the next term at school. There was a faint mark on it, as if someone had written with a pencil, and the rain had read it. I knelt and squinted and saw, with the sort of sudden heat one gets in the face when one is a fool publicly, that a girl had once knelt here and written her name where no one could see, Ruth. Only the H remained in the stone's memory, a loop that had no way of telling you who it had once belonged to. I laughed, and the sound surprised me, because it did not hurt. Some things do not leave us, I said. Some things, he agreed, require us to stay long enough to notice. He took the ledger away. The house let it. Houses know when their contents must move to make them more honest. The weeks that followed were a procession of questions dressed in grey. Men and women came with pens and machines that remember everything. They asked about the comings and goings, the children's names, the coins like moons that changed hands, the afternoons when the light in the long gallery went yellow and made even sad news look like something to place in a frame. I told the truth until my mouth felt full of a new kind of tiredness. It is heavy work to lift the lid from something that has been lidded expertly for so long. A reporter came. She wore boots the colour of tea and listened with her chin set in, a way that told me she was trying not to be angry at the wrong things. Why now? She asked me when we were sitting in the kitchen with the good cups. Why tell this now? Because the house told me to, I said, and she almost rolled her eyes before she realized I was being literal. I told her about this floorboard and the ring and the ledger, and the way the draft in the long gallery lifts the curtain when it is time to stop sleeping in a life you have made too comfortable for yourself. She took a photograph of my hands without asking, the way people take photographs of teacups when they wish to soften the news, and I forgave her. The story went out. It ran down streets I'd never walked and found ears I would never meet. I became, to my own confusion, a sort of altar at which people came to lay their own small confessions. I received letters with warm fingerprints on them and postcards from schools where teachers said things like courage and light. They praised my name, and I stood in the library with the plaque on the wall and felt that I had simply done the chores. The house had asked of me that day, open the window, lift the lid, call the police, remember how to say please. My dear, I see your eyes. You think perhaps that was the end. We found the ledger, we buried the ring, the world clapped its hands, and an old woman polished a brass plaque with her sleeve and went to bed early. But stories that have lived this long do not end where the applause begins. There were letters we had not opened yet. There was a note in Thomas's handwriting that slipped free of the ledger's backboard in the third week and fell like a moth. There was the child who came back, knocking softly on a door that has not known his knuckles since the day the house refused to let the hinge close. There was a fire I had not yet accounted for, the one that burned in my own chest, and the one that did not take the kitchen, because I had once saved the boy who would come back with eyes that reminded me of a man who had written me a hand-shaped poem. Shall I take you to that knock now? Or perhaps you need a sip of water, a small walk, a stretch of the legs. Come back, sit. It is only beginning to get dark. Shall I take you to that knock now? The one that sounds like a future, standing on one leg, wondering if it dares to come in. It was the sort of late afternoon that pretends to be gentle, and then puts its hand on your shoulder a bit too tightly. The house had gone quiet in that loyal way it does when I am about to meet something it wants me to meet alone. The rain had loosened its grip. The garden smelled of apologies. And then 3 knocks, each one smaller than the last, as if these knuckles were not entirely certain of themselves. I opened the door to a man with a straight back, and hands he did not know where to put. He was not tall, not small, simply built to bear weight. His hair had chosen grey before most men's do, and that suited him. He held a cap in one hand, and the other rested on the shoulder of a girl who peered around him with the serious eyes children get when they've been told they are about to meet someone important, and they are practicing how not to laugh at the wrong moment. "Mrs. Avery," he asked, and then corrected himself. "Ruth. I do not begrudge a man the softness of my Christian name when he has earned it." "Yes," I said, and the air between us found its right temperature. "I'm William. Cross," he said, and the name rose in my ear like steam. "They used to call me Billy. I slept in your nursery. His breath failed the way a brave person's breath fails when the kindness in a room removes the last excuse for being stoic. He looked down, then up, a man rearranging himself. "I read about you in the paper. I saw the house in the photograph, and I thought, if my knees still remembered those stairs, I will know what to say when she opens the door." The girl tilted her head and whispered loudly, "Granddad, is this the lady who saved you from the bad air?" He nodded, without taking his eyes off me, and we both laughed at her phrasing because laughter is a good umbrella when you are suddenly all weather. "Come in," I said. "This house loves people who grew out of it." In the hall, they both reached for the skeleton clock at once, as if to assure it of their presence. He drew his hand back, embarrassed, and said, "It used to sound like a promise when I crept past. Still does. It's kept us honest," I answered. "Tea." In the kitchen, he declined it with the politeness of a man who has to hurry but doesn't wish to. He took something from his coat, a small packet wrapped in waxed paper, and laid it on the table. He undid it the way you undo something that ought to have been in a museum, and instead lived in a pocket. Inside was a scrap of paper, blackened and bubbled at the edges, with the ghost of a column and 3 words still legible as scars: comfort, transfer, fee. "I found it in a wall when we renovated the old station yard," he said. "Charred, but kept. It stuck to the plaster, like a tongue to a cold rail. I didn't know why I kept it then. Thought perhaps it was for the men who died there. Then I read your name in the paper, with the words they use for women who do the right thing at the wrong time and refuse to apologize. And I thought perhaps this belonged to you, or to someone you're helping. My dear, forgive me." I pressed my hand to my throat. It is a little habit I have when the world puts a puzzle piece back that I didn't know was missing. "Thank you," I said. "I know the man who will know where to put this." The little girl looked around the kitchen, her gaze restless with the greed of childhood for every detail. "It smells like toast," she announced. "It always does," I told her. "Even in storms. The house believes in bread." William's mouth softened at that. "I wanted to bring you something else," he said. From his other pocket, he took a triangle of green wool, ragged, the edge hand-stitched in the manner of women sitting through news they cannot change. The nursery blanket, mine, ours. The small corner with the red thread knot I had used to mark it in the days when names were a luxury we borrowed for the length of a war. "I am a fireman," he added, embarrassed to be a man bragging in a kitchen where women had baked courage. "Retired now, but I went into burning rooms for years and forgot to be terrified because you carried me up a different set of stairs once and promised me air. My granddaughter's called Ruth. We thought you should know that the rope you threw down held." He said it simply. He did not make it into a monument. Men like William live their thanks in the work of their hands, and appear in kitchens with small relics when the work is done. I touched the blanket. I could have put my face in it and smelt the night I pulled him back from the cellar. But I have learned to leave some things in the cupboard where the memory keeps them warm. You saved me too, I said. A house saves no one unless there is someone in it to use the doors it refuses. And that night you taught me the difference between fear and caution. He frowned, not understanding, and I spared him my philosophy. Thank you for keeping the thread. Before he left, he put his hand on the door jamb, the way believers touch icon, and looked as if he would like to say a prayer, but could not remember the words. We'll come back with flowers, he said. For the willow, she should have some. It's time I told her something too. They went, and the house, satisfied, let me be alone with the piece of blackened ledger that had found its way home. I put it on the library table where the light sits quietly, and thought of D.C. Finch and how his mouth would harden when he recognized the handwriting and the column names that had been foolish enough to survive fire. 3 weeks later, how clever. Time is the way it lies down beside you and does not tell you what it will whisper next. I was in that same chair when D.C. Finch came back with the official posture care can give a man with a terrible job. He had the ledger, sheathed in plastic, and the bundle of letters, now catalogued and labelled, as if they were rare birds rescued from oil. He had papers for me to read, and words like depositions and statements. He had, tucked in the ledger where the binding had been loosed by heat and time, a note that had not belonged to any inventory. It fell out, he said, almost apologetically, and laid it in my lap. Thought you should be the first to read it. It seems addressed. It was on the stiff cream that stationers sell to men who like their sins to look expensive. The handwriting was Thomas's. I would have known it in the dark by the way his T's cross with 2 decisive strokes, as if letters could be made more true by insisting. Ruth, forgive me. It began without the courage to include a dear. I read it slowly, aloud in my head, the way you read something the heart is going to have a reaction to, and you want to make sure it reacts to the right thing. He wrote that he had loved me. He wrote that he had intercepted Elias's letters because he could not bear to lose me to a life that would have asked me to be industrious instead of luminous. He wrote that he had disliked the way Elias laughed. Too open, he said, and the way men like that teach a woman to want things she cannot afford to keep. He wrote that he had told himself lies about charity, the way a man tells himself about the weather. It was not his fault. It was the sky's. He wrote about the adoptions and the fees and the words he had used to launder the things he wanted. He wrote that the night the warehouse burned, he had gone with his ring on and his careful coat and had put money into the pocket of a man who had seen too much smoke to notice. He wrote that he had never ordered a fire. He wrote that the world, hungry, sets itself alight more often than we admit and asks for coins later. He wrote that he had written Elias a letter he never sent and I would never see, and that when he had finally braced himself to speak to me, to ruin the good opinion I had of him by telling me the truth, his heart had refused to practice this gentleness and had stopped in the library where I now sat, the decent man struck down by his own machinery. He wrote that he was sorry for making the house hold his secrets. He wrote that he had loved the way I stood at windows and chose hope, like a dress. He wrote that I should have married the poet, that the roof would have been worse, but the weather inside me would have been better. He wrote he had bought the skeleton clock because he thought if the heart of time were visible, it would forgive him eventually for making it lie. He begged me, in words that looked like bones, to forgive him. I folded the letter. I put my hand on the table, the way a woman does when she is about to steady a bowl, and realized I was steadying myself. I did not cry. Grief is an animal I have learned to feed without letting it into my bed. And then, because the house refuses to let even ghosts exist alone, I felt the small shift in air that means a guest has come into a room where you have borne your solitude long enough. May I? DC Finch asked, though he had not yet made a noise. And I nodded. He sits with women in rooms and waits for them to decide which words they are prepared to have archived. He does it well. He stood by the window because he knows better than to take my chair. Will you forgive him? He asked finally, and there was no official in it, only a son who had learned. There are questions that will make us better if we answer them honestly. I already did, in the way that matters, I said, surprised by my own voice. Not for the ledger, not for the bribe, not for the door that almost shut on the boy you never met, but for the small frightened man inside the larger one who believed he had to remove love from my letterbox to own it. I forgive that man. I do not forgive what he did as if it were nothing, but I refuse to let the worst thing he did be the last thing he is. That, he said quietly, might be the bravest room anyone's ever put a man in. My dear, before I go on, only a handful of paragraphs more, and the house and I will take our nap. If this has walked with you through any of your own rooms, do stay with me till the last. Subscribe if you wish. It makes my old kettle sing to imagine you coming back. And tell me, what would forgiveness look like between your walls? Have you tried to make one room more merciful than the others? I would like to tell you, this is where the house rested. It is not. Houses love a climax, as much as theatres do. The storm came at the end of that week, with the theatrical gusto British weather uses when it wishes to remind you that you live on an island, and everything here is dramatically damp. Lightning wrote its rude letters across the sky. Thunder made the light fixtures clear their throats. I had set the newspapers in a neat stack by the kitchen dresser, and I was halfway up the stairs with my night things in one hand when I smelled something that was not toast, and not coal, and not history. Smoke is a language. Once you learn it, you never forget your vocabulary. I went down the stairs, faster than my knees call respectable. In the kitchen, a foolish towel I had left too friendly with the stove had caught, and the heat had persuaded the curtains to flirt. Flames are chatty, insistent friends. They will introduce themselves to anything. I did what women do when no one has yet called the men. I moved what could be moved. I covered what could be smothered. I opened what could usher danger out rather than in. I pulled the curtain away and the bar unsocketed in my hand. The window refused me. The latch stuck. How clever this house is. And then, with a sound that was exactly like the small humility a hinge must feel when it decides to risk itself for you, it gave. Air rushed, flame bowed, the towel died. But above me, I heard the old, untreated beam make a noise that lives between inquiry and complaint. It has always been the beam's habit to narrate. Sparks jumped. I had done enough foolish things in my life not to do one more. I stepped into the hall and called without thinking, without shame, for the first time in a very long time. Help! Do you know what good houses do when you say that word and mean it? They answer not with words, but with witness. 4 minutes later, it felt like a novel. Sirens said they were coming, and then they were not quite here yet. And then the garden was briefly confetti, red lights cutting through rain. The door opened with a certainty that made the storm step back. The man in front took his helmet off as he crossed the threshold, as if the house were a church. And there was William, 30 years folded into one firm look. He led his crew the way good men lead. They made their way around corners, like a polite argument. "Mrs. Avery," he said, "we've got you." They did. They took the hot from the room and carried it outside. They spoke to the fire the way you speak to a child, having a tantrum, firmly, without losing your love. I stood in the hall with my palm on the skeleton clock and listened to it keep time as if nothing was different, which is its job. When William came back from the kitchen, steam on his helmet, face ridiculous with sincerity, he grinned like the boy who had once decided the cellar could not scare him, because I had told him it could. "You saved me then," he said. "I've owed you this one, the house." I corrected him gently, glancing toward the long gallery where the breeze had opened the curtain over the mirror again, as if to say, "Remember, I show you what you are." I merely used the hinges. They left as they came, tidy, embarrassed by relief. I shut the door on the weather and the applause of the gravel. The house leaned back into itself, as one does after a portrait sitter has gone. I touched the scorch mark on the curtains and thought how honest fabric is when it tells the truth about its day. A week later, when the insurance men had gone and the paint on the windowsills had forgiven the soot, DC Finch returned with a different kind of news. He did not come alone. He brought a woman with hands the shape of gardening, and a face that had been pretty, and then been wise, and had decided it liked wise better. "This is my mother," he said. "She wanted to bring you something, and to hear your voice. She held out a thick envelope, tied with a ribbon that had learned patience. I kept something of his," she said, without preamble. "Elias. I kept the letter he wrote the day before. The day before, the water turned the sky black. I couldn't bring myself to burn it with the others when I tried to be done. I think it belongs to you now." Inside was a single, folded sheet and a pressed leaf from the willow. Its veins still a map, long after the sap had gone. My name on the paper, in a hand I had held and let go. "My dear Ruth." He wrote that he had waited for me again, and learned to call waiting by different names, so it would not hurt. A nap, a poem, a promise I happened to be keeping from a different angle. He wrote that a gentleman had come to see, him with a coin purse, and the righteousness only respectable men can afford, and said words that had the smell of finality. He wrote that he had laughed in the man's face, and then cried in the yard where no one could see. He wrote that he was going to leave the ring with someone who would remember what it meant if I did not come, and then he stopped his sentence, halfway through, as if to show me what being interrupted feels like. The leaf was the size of my palm. We sat in the library where the fire no longer felt like a performance, and read the letter twice, once with the old man's son in the room, once in the places inside us, where both of us knew what it is to allow a father to be both honest and beloved and fallible, and no longer here. When we were done, we did not pity him. Pity has a way of tidying a man who died of his own courage. We did something harder. We admitted that love behaves like a faithful dog and will wait at the same tree for years, even if the person it is waiting for married someone else and learned to make marmalade without crying. The investigation finished itself, like a story finally, letting its shoulders drop. The papers said the words they say when a man's reputation is asked to move its furniture around. Scandal, funds, violation, praise. They said bravery too, about the men in the warehouse, not about the men who counted. They used my name when they needed a picture of a woman who did not flinch the way they expected. They said whistleblower, and widow, and activist, and the epitaphs. We lay across living women when we want a neat reason to stare. People came to the house, not coaches, not too many, just enough to keep the hall rug honest, and walked the long gallery and read the displays in the library. They touched the brass plaque with my name on it like a luckstone. It warmed where their fingers lingered. The world, my dear, did what it does when it chooses a person to praise. It made me into a story more easily told than the woman who lives underneath it. I had a choice to become a statue in my own hallway or to keep boiling the kettle and answering the door myself. I chose the kettle. I don't want you to think me modest. I like the plaque. It is a good weight on the wall, but I would rather my name be used in this house as a bell than as a sermon. And Thomas, let me tell you what I did where he is concerned, because a story that pretends to forgiveness and does not show you the hands it used to make it is only architecture. I took off his ring one evening and placed it on the library table under the lamp. I told him, out loud, from inside my small practical heart, the shape of the room I had made for him in my memories. It is not one with windows. It has a chair angled to the door, and a ledger he is not allowed to open without me in the room, and it has a picture on the wall of a willow that took in a ring and made it into sap, the way trees baptize our junk and make it into him. I told him he was welcome to sit there, if he wished, for as long as he wished, and then I put my ring back on my finger, because I am a wife, still, yes, to the parts of my life I chose, and refused to abandon even when their varnish wore off. As for the house, it did what all good houses do, when something finally true has been said within them, it loosened. A draught I had always thought of as a nuisance became weather. The blue light in the long gallery looked less mournful and more like a lake you could swim in if you knew how to breathe differently. The mirror did not pretend to show me anyone other than myself, and when I turned away, my own back looked like its own loyalty. We had one more secret to tend to. Do you remember, at the beginning? Oh, it seems so long ago. Look how faithful. You are to sit with me through all this. The note I said I wrote in pencil on the nursery wall. The one no one had noticed. That foolish little girl, who is still living somewhere behind my clavicles, had written a promise where a child would lie. I will love what returns. I went into the nursery with a candle, because sometimes a candle makes honesty gentler. I pulled, sighed the bed, the one with the green blanket folded and waiting in case the girl named Ruth comes back with her grandfather. And I found it there. The light stroke of graphite, my childish hand, the sentence that had waited so patiently to be caught up with. I traced the letters with my finger, and for the first time since I was 19, I allowed myself to cry, not for what was taken, not for what was stolen, but for what had kept its appointment. Me, in this house, with this life, with the will, to love what had the courage to come back, even if it came in a different suit. There is a photograph of me now in the brochure they hand to visitors who do not know how to take their shoes off in old houses. I am standing by the skeleton clock, which never misses its cue, and I am smiling in a way that resembles forgiveness. It is not that I do not remember. It is that remembering and forgiving have learned to sit on the same chair without pushing one another off, and the chair has stopped squeaking about it. My dear, before I say goodnight, if any of this found you in a place where a door had jammed, may it loosen for you tonight. If it did, subscribe and stay. I keep the kettle on for the ones who return. And tell me, have you ever found a piece of your past that asked you to change how you held your future? It would be an honor to hear you. When people ask me now what the world's praise feels like, I tell them the truth. It feels like standing in a kitchen that didn't quite burn, with scorch marks you decide not to paint over yet because they tell you something you must keep telling yourself. It feels like letters arriving very late and being exactly on time. It feels like a young policeman with his father's eyes placing a poem shaped like a hand into yours. It feels like a grown boy with his granddaughter and a scrap of green wool and the clean gratitude of a man who has kept others breathing for a living. It feels like a house that finally exhaled and said my name in a voice I recognized as my own. The last Sunday of summer, DC Finch came by with his mother and a small plant in a pot too large for it. "For the window," she said, smiling a younger smile at me than she thought she had left. We set it on the sill, and the light made its little leaves transparent, and the house almost clapped its hands. When they left, I did what I do when there have been visitors, and my pulse has been kind. I walked the corridor, touching the door frames, thanking them the way you thank a friend for staying, until you turned the corner of your day. In the library, I wound the clock. It made that intimate sound gears make when they lean into one another. Like a whispered agreement, the minute hand moved. The second hand began its soft braveries. Outside, the willow kept her counsel, which is all a woman like me can ask of. A tree who knows my rings, and my rings' secrets, both. I sat down, finally, and let the house put its hand on my shoulder, in the friendly way, the way that does not press. If you stayed with me till the end, my dear, thank you. Tell me the time and country you're watching from in the comments. It warms my old heart knowing where my stories travel.